Ooh, makes me happy. Come on. We can do it. Woohoo! All right.
You're better than I, Gunga Din. That's great.
I am telling you what, it has taken something for me. It really has. There's been, you know, it's just been really interesting. So funny watching some of my other videos. So I'm like, I use my hands a lot. One would think that I'm Italian. Okay, there we are. Awesome. I'm going to turn down my volume. I'm going to go to comments and I'm going to invite people. Hello, everyone. Okay. Hey, wow. We've already got 2 people watching. All right. So I'm going to go back over to Zoom because it's very distracting watching myself on Facebook Live. And then because see, I monitor the questions on my phone. Technology. See, we got Zoe on. Let's see. Let's share with people, shall we? We're going to share with David and Kim and Lisa Haba and Jim and Dana and Tomas and Danny. We've been getting regularly about 100 people watching us all at the same time, which is kind of cool.
That is cool.
Yeah. You know, so I just really appreciate people taking the time. And I think people appreciate us having this conversation. Hey, Jennifer, glad you're on tonight. Hey, Donna. Oh, gosh. Let's see, who else? Marlene is on with us. Oh, my God, Marlene. I did the Fireball Run with Marlene years ago. It's where we raise awareness about missing children. I'm so glad she's on. And Samara. Awesome. Okay. Yay, and Renata's on. Renata's been on almost every single night, and she's asked some really great questions. So I'm grateful for when people participate with us on a regular basis, you know, because then we get to, okay, good. Now we're on gallery view, so it's me and you. All right, okay, so we're just gonna go ahead. We started 2 minutes early last night. We're gonna keep doing that again tonight. So I just wanna welcome everyone. This is our final night. We're going to do a recap on Saturday of Educate at 8. And I am just so happy that Dr. Toal, was able to be available tonight for us because he is the Senior Vice President of Residential Services at Aspire Healthcare. And he has been an advocate and a warrior on the front lines for survivors. Y'all know I do prevention work. And what keeps me going is when I hear what survivors are dealing with, because I don't want anybody, like really, if I have a choice, I don't want anyone to have to live that life. So we're doing everything we can on the front lines to prevent it. And so grateful for people like United Abolitionists, Tomas Lars, Connie Rose, and for people like Dr. Toal. So Dr. Toal, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, nice to be here tonight.
Yeah, and so is there anything I missed in your introduction that you want to share with anybody?
Just probably want to let people know I'm a licensed mental health counselor, so I've been in the field of behavioral health care for over 40 years. And I have been working with the human trafficking population about the last 10 years through Aspire Health Partners. And I also sit on the Florida Task Force for working with trafficking, appointed by the General.
Appointed by Attorney General, really, really great. Yeah, so you have just a little bit of knowledge about this topic.
and focusing on the trauma and the substance abuse, the mental health aspects of trafficking, and really working towards restoring their lives.
Yeah, which is such an important piece about what this whole circle of what we all do.
Yes.
So thank you for your work, and thank you for your dedication and commitment. It makes, I know it makes a huge difference in the lives of the men and women that you make a difference for.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So we're going to get right into our first debunking of our myths tonight. And the one I'm going to start off with is, it's a complicated topic to pull apart. And I think you're the perfect one to do this. And that is, the prostitution myth that women on the streets or, in escort services they actually, and I'm going to put in quotes, choose that life, versus being human trafficked. So let's pull that apart a little bit. So if you can kind of give us some background about what you know about the intertanglement of those two things that would really make a difference for people.
Sure, absolutely. And it's an excellent point to make, because it really is a struggle in breaking that apart, because very often people want to say prostitution is one aspect and human trafficking is another. And really, for me, and I will say to you, I believe prostitution is human trafficking.
I would agree.
And I say that from the perspective of, when you take a look at doing something out of choice versus doing something out of necessity, it changes the dynamic. And I don't know any woman that engages in prostitution merely out of choice. It is most frequently out of necessity. And so when you place that issue of necessity in there, it really takes all opportunity for self-control away.
Right.
In the lives of people who prostitute, it really may be survival sex. It may be the way in which they're able to make ends meet. And I actually had a recent client say that she was grateful from the perspective that she was taught a way to support herself. However, she was always able to say, but not in the best way that I could. It may have been in the only way that she could at the time, but not in the best way. And I think that struggle in breaking apart prostitution versus human trafficking really gets down to the basic premise of what we need to be doing with all of our survivors, is the installation of hope. And indeed the process that life can be different than it has been for you.
Yeah, and along those same lines, from what I understand, right? I'm not an expert on that side, right? But I have a fairly deep understanding that it's similar to domestic violence victims. It's like they have to leave up to 7 times before they actually stay away from their abuser. Human trafficking is very similar. And I want you to talk a little bit about, the drop-in center and what y'all have created with United Abolitionists in Orange County for women to know that they have a place to go.
And actually, our program is a short-term residential treatment program for survivors of human trafficking. And that's sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Although I would say to you that we opened February 1st, 2018, and we've treated about 125 women during that period of time. Only one of them was a labor trafficking survivor, and only one of them was from outside the United States.
Wow.
And so the majority of our women, all but one of our women, have been domestic sex trafficking, which is another common myth, that it's always from women and from outside the United States. However, that's not an uncommon occurrence to be U.S. Domestic trafficking. So our program is really designed, and it's kind of morphed over the last 2 years. We really saw ourselves initially as a shelter where women could come in, maybe stay a few days, maybe a few weeks, get themselves stabilized and out the door. And what we've learned over the last 2 years, and we're getting women that are raw, that were pulled out of the trafficking situation last night or this morning. And they're coming to us directly from their trafficker when they're at their most vulnerable. And so we bring them in for an evaluation for what we call a human trafficking screening, which is first to determine, are there any major medical issues going on that they need treatment for? Is there a need for detoxification from substances that they may have been using or that may have been used with them to help control them? Then we bring them in, and I now have begun to take a look at it as ICU, intensive care. So we bring you in, we stabilize you from that very high level of exposure to trafficking and the most vulnerable that you have been physically, emotionally, sexually abused and traumatized. And so, and I don't know anybody, and I share this with the women because I do group with the women once a week. And so I share with the women, I don't know anybody who's admitted into the ER, goes to intensive care, and then gets discharged out of intensive care and goes home. You get stepped down into another unit, because then you're stabilized with your crisis, and then you move to ongoing support until you can be discharged. And that's really what our program is about. We're going to stabilize you in that high level of crisis, begin to help you look at what needs to be done in order to move you through this whole process, because it's a 2 to 3 year process for the brain to heal from the trauma, from trauma in general, but specifically from human trafficking trauma.
Well, hang on, I'm going to pause you right there, and I'm going to have you repeat that, because I think that is so important for people to hear. That is a 2 to 3 year process just to heal.
and that's the aspect for the brain to heal from trauma. There are brain changes that take place with all trauma. But when you take a look at human trafficking trauma, the most severe of traumas, in my opinion, 2 to 3 years, because there's 3 levels of the brain that are changed, literally changed with trafficking and trauma. One is that primal brain, or where the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism occurs. So think of it in terms of
the amygdala.
Right. And when you get your bike, remember your bicycle and the sprockets where the pedals are, and you stick a stick in there and the pedals aren't going to go any further. That's what happens. They freeze. They get stuck at that place where everything they see, everything they look at, everyone that they're involved with is dangerous and in fact is life-threatening. So that's their constant response, because that's the way their lives were in the experience of trafficking. There really was no guarantee of anybody being helpful to them in that experience of trafficking. The second area is that midbrain with the emotional regulation. So the way to think about that is where emotion doesn't equal the stimulus. The emotion doesn't equal the experience. So in our program, if I ask you, would you mind making your bed? Suddenly they're on the ceiling screaming at us because they can't differentiate between what's a reasonable emotional response to the circumstance, because the brain changed. So I can look at you and say, you know what, I want you to turn the sky green. You're going to look at me like I'm crazy, because you can't do it. They cannot do it in that experience of the trauma of the brain. And the final one is the frontal lobe, the frontal lobe with the executive functions of the brain: reason, judgment, impulse control, mood. And so when we're looking at them, expecting them to respond normally, quote unquote, in an experience, they can't. Not because they don't want to, neurologically they cannot. And until we create the environment,
yeah,
and the brain cannot feel until you pull them out.
What you're saying is so rich and deep, Dr. Toal. I just want to pause for a minute and let some of that sink in. I want to recap it for people, because this is the piece that last night we talked about, or a couple of nights ago, with victims. Well, why don't they just leave? You're explaining why they literally can't leave, because there's trauma to the amygdala, there's trauma to the midbrain, and then there's trauma to the prefrontal cortex. And depending on the age all of this happens, then they're stuck in that particular place.
And the length of time the trauma has occurred. And so until you can remove the trauma or remove the individual from the trauma, the healing doesn't begin. And it's got to be a sustained period of time for the healing to occur over time. So the struggle, particularly the struggle that many of us working in the field have with survivors, is that, wait a minute, you should be appreciative of the things that we want to offer you. They can't, because everywhere they look is danger. And so the research shows that we've got to instill hope and we've got to build trust. Those are 2 essential ingredients in helping these women and men move through the experience of trafficking. And are we able to do that when they're so frightened and they're fighting for their lives every step of the way, even when it's make your bed? It's a struggle. And so we got to work continuously, engage them in services to create those opportunities for trust and the installation of hope, the hope that tomorrow can be and will be better.
Wow. Yeah. So I want to acknowledge some people that are watching us this evening. So we've got, hey, Nancy. Nancy and I went to high school, so that's pretty cool, in college. And Jennifer and Mary and Tracy's on. She works with the Seminole County Sheriffs. Jerry, Aster, Juliana, she just said, you just described me to a T. Right. So I've got several friends that have had personal trauma. And then Representative Fitzenhagen's watching. So this is great information that's getting to really important people about the importance of doing work with survivors. So that really describes and really debunks the prostitution myth, because no one would choose that life. However, given everything you've just explained, it makes total sense why they can't leave. And it's going to lead right into the next myth that we're going to talk about, which is survivors only return to traffickers. They come in, they get healed for a little period of time. And you shared earlier that it really does take 2 to 3 years for the brain to do the healing. So the myth is they only go back to survivors, or they only go back to their trafficker. So let's debunk that myth a little bit.
Well, first of all, through practical experience, we know that that's not accurate. The number of women that we've treated in our experience, and others that we've worked with over the years, you can create and do create this experience of building that trust over time, and to recognize that, because when we take a look at it, our unit being ICU, the next step is, what's the next level of appropriate care for you? Very often, and most often, I'm saying that's some kind of safe house experience where people who are trained in human trafficking can continue to be that supportive environment. We have many, many of our women that go into those experiences and then are maintained over time as that healing continues. So in our program, we take them to a certain level, and then they move into the next level of care, when I refer to as that, then the next step in the restoration of their lives. And sometimes, and I say to our women, sometimes to give you the life that you deserve, that you may never have had, because for many of our women, the human trafficking started very, very early. We've had clients as young as 2 years old being trafficked by family and loved ones. And so when you're trafficked at 2, there's no connection to anything that can appear to be even some semblance of normality. However, our women are resilient. One of the most exciting things about working with this program is that we find that these women are so resilient, and I remind them every week, you're sitting here in this room believing that life can be different because you come day after day, group after group, and we're a program that they stay with us for an extended period of time. So the resilience is beyond belief, because they begin to take a look at that trust and hope. So their desires are not to return to the trafficker, not to say that some of them don't return to the trafficker, because many of them do, but many of them do not. There are many survivors that have gone on to be able to develop lives that they, number one, deserve, number two, that they've earned, and that those of us working in the field can really support them in giving.
Really beautiful. And I want to address a little bit, because we do know that there is some push me, pull you with survivors sometimes, as they do go back to their trafficker, but that has to do with the not healing of the brain, correct?
Absolutely.
So trauma bonding. Let's talk a little bit about the trauma bonding, because I think that's the misconception. It's like, oh, well, they're trauma bond, so they have to go back. And you've just shared no, they don't have to go back. When they start to discover that there is hope and they start to tap into their resilience, the exciting part of that, right, is they actually have that shot. So let's talk a little bit about the trauma bonding and ways that you work with them to start to diminish that.
Well, one thing that we really need to ask ourselves in kind of debunking that idea that they want to return to the trafficker is what particularly when they're so young, when they're entering into the life of trafficking in the first place. As we all know, the average age of entering into trafficking is 11 to 14. Our formative years, the years when we're developing a sense of self-esteem and self-worth, when we're looking at that typical adolescent development of separation, individuation from our families of origin. And when you experience a greater level of vulnerability for trafficking in the first place, and someone comes along and promises you and begins to tell you, you're the most important thing in the world to me, that I love you, I care for you, no one else can care for you the way that I do. No one else is going to love you the way that I do. They also at the same time are undermining their sense of self-esteem and self-worth, so that the only person you can really rely on is me. And then the trafficker obviously begins to take advantage of them and leaves them with the place of, but he's the only one that will love me, or she's the only one that will ever care for me. You can leave me, but no one else is going to want you. And they come to believe that. So we all know how difficult it is to overcome that really low sense of self and not believing that I'm worth anything, because that's what they're told eventually by the trafficker. You're worthless. You're just lucky that someone like me wants to have you around. And so that struggle and breaking away when they feel like there's nothing in their core being that is salvageable. And that's one of the key factors in helping them develop the insight to say, wait a minute, I am worthy. I am valuable. So we talk about the installation of hope, and we talk about the need for trust. Those are the things that we need to develop. The interventions are cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness awareness, along with EMDR, that really then help them shift and change the thought processes. Literally in the groups that I do, insight develops week after week. A light bulb will go on for her and she'll say, oh my gosh, he really didn't care about me. he really didn't love me.
And that's really where the hope comes in, when they actually start to discover their own worth and their own self-confidence, and building those muscles up over time. Hence the 2 to 3 years of the brain healing is so important. So really great. This is so great. Such great information. The next myth we're going to debunk is that trafficking is always associated with a violent crime. Like it's always gang related, or there's something of violence, happening that leads to, trafficking. That's always associated with that. So let's debunk that myth a little bit.
When we think in terms of 56% of those trafficked are trafficked by family members or people they know well, first of all, it helps to debunk that. It's the idea that there's this grooming that goes on. There's this alignment of association with the trafficking survivor that lulls them into this perceived relationship. And so that, I always tell people, I don't meet you and I pull you and I start trafficking you half an hour from now. It's that development of that relationship. And then very quickly but if you really love me, you'd have sex with my friend. If you really love me, you'd have sex with 5 of my friends. If you really love me, you'd help us to pay the bills. So you need to go out there and peddle yourself. So most often it's not violence. There may be violence related to the control and coercion, but it's not always a violent situation. Very often it's, high-end stuff that continues to move into that area of taking control. I always tell the women, anybody that takes control away from your choices about your own body is a trafficker, is not a good thing.
Right. And, it's interesting because when I go out and talk to the kids and I share with them, I said, I'm globally apologizing for all your parents. And they all kind of look at me and I said, y'all remember that family reunion or that block party or that, family gathering, whether it was a wedding or somebody's, big, whatever, 50th birthday party. There was always that one family member or a friend of a family that your mom always wanted you to go hug, or your dad said, go hug so-and-so goodbye, and you didn't want to. And they're all like, yeah, they remember that person. I said, in that moment when they had you go do that, they just took away your right to what you wanted to do with your body with other people. And they, like you can just see them, like light bulbs are popping. And I said, that feeling y'all had? And they're like, yes. I go, that instinct right there. I said, that's what you still have it. You still listen to that. I said, I don't care if your best friends, brothers, uncles, sisters, cousin invites you to a party, you don't go. Because you don't know who's going to be there. And you trust your gut. When someone says, hey, come with me to go here, and your gut says, don't do it. Because that's the beginning of the manipulation. And it's so subtle, isn't it?
Yes, often very subtle. So subtle that they don't even recognize that it's beginning to occur. And in fact, will argue with you that it's occurring.
Wow. Yeah.
No, that's what he meant. That's not what he meant. No, not at all. When in fact, ultimately we know he did or she did.
Yeah. Because that's the other thing too that we've talked about is most victims don't self-identify.
It would sound uncommon for us in other aspects of Aspire that we're ongoing treatment in substance abuse or mental health, and 3 or 4 weeks into treatment, they begin to admit that there may have been some trafficking experience, or staff themselves may identify. It sounds like perhaps you may have in fact been trafficked. And they're like, what? What do you mean? And then as it unfolds, it's like, oh my gosh, I really was. And so that's not uncommon at all.
Wow. And, I think it's really interesting too, because I've had conversations with several of my friends, when we get on Facebook or we're, I'm out and we're leading some conversation, that they'll come up to me and go, I think that was me. The memory gets repressed, the experience gets repressed. And, I've got several girlfriends that as adults said, I didn't realize that was me until you talked. And I'm like, great. Now, what are you going to go do about that?
And another one of those pieces is, to debunk the myth is the shame and guilt.
Yes.
That I deserve this. And the myth for the survivors is that you didn't deserve that. You
No.
never deserve someone taking your right away to make choices in your own life.
No.
And yet they'll say, but I wanted the drugs, so I was there. You know, so it's like, that may be true. I'll give you that you wanted the drugs, but that's a whole different story. That's not about someone taking away the choice for you to make decisions about how your body is used. No one has that right. So sometimes we have to deal with the myths within the survivors themselves.
Isn't that interesting? That the trauma to the brain has them see something so completely differently that's so obvious to someone on the outside. Now, you know, I want to take that conversation a little bit and tease it out a little bit farther, because the thing that I do know over the past 8 days that we've been doing the Debunking Myths is people have reached out to me, you know, and I want to empower our parents. That's why we're having this conversation, so our parents can actually, you know, educate their kids and be educated themselves. But, you know, what if during this time someone picks up the phone and calls someone watching, or someone watching the you know, when we play it again, and they're like, my husband's ex or my boyfriend's doing this to me, or I'm, you know, whatever that is. What can people do if someone they know in their life calls them and says, I think I'm being trafficked, or I'm being abused? You know, what do I say to them? What do I do? What actions do I take?
Well, certainly first and foremost is to understand what level of vulnerability do they have, i.e. are they underage? If they're underage, we obviously immediately need to be reporting that to the Department of Children and Families. With enough information, they can begin an investigation and we can do what we need to do. And today in Florida, at least, and I think in most states, but I know for a fact here in Florida, that the Department of Children and Families is assessing every youth for the potential for trafficking. And so that's a question that's on that investigative report to take a look at. Is this the potential for human trafficking? If it's an adult person, intervening on behalf of those that may be being trafficked. So if you were to get a phone call to say, I think that I'm being trafficked, or I think that my daughter may be being groomed for trafficking, reach out to those who know and let us begin that process of evaluation and investigation to provide that education and support. Particularly for adolescents, there's a lot of good curriculum around anti-trafficking. My Life, My Choice, Love 146, Not a Number, the work that you do with prevention of, you know, and teaching youth to take a look at and recognizing and identifying what trafficking looks like, so that you may see that in a peer and be able to intervene on behalf of that peer. And even that intervention is saying to a school personnel or to a parent or to some other caregiver in the system that this person may be being traumatized and trafficked in some way.
Right. Exactly. And I think that's part of the, you know, how many times you and I have, you know, been out in the public sharing what we do, and people come up and tell a story about they saw something similar to what we described and they didn't do anything because they didn't know what to do.
Mental Health First for Youth, which I'm a trainer, talks about the protective factors in the life of our youth. And one of those is at least one adult, whether it's your parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or a neighbor, someone appropriate, one adult in your life that you feel is safe and secure for you is a protective factor. So finding that person, and you can say, I think I might be in trouble. And then from there, adults can handle it and support you through that process.
Absolutely. And the other thing too, we talk to parents a lot about is if your child comes up and tells you, hey, I think someone's grooming me, or, hey, I think my friend's in trouble, or, hey, someone touched me inappropriately, believe them.
Absolutely believe them. Believe them believe them. You know, and take a look. We talk about what are the signs and symptoms, what are the greater vulnerabilities. Adults should not be interacting with youth, you know, in ways that they should be interacting only with other adults. And when you see kinds of behaviors occurring, that's a sign. Something's going on. You may not even know what it is yet. So you take a close look. You know, parents get involved. You know, where are the computers? You know, in relationship to where you're at in the home. Parental controls, cyber bullying, cyber sex, cyber predators are out there in every home looking for youth that are vulnerable. And so it's really key that as adults, we're acting in ways, the appropriate adults are acting in ways to help the youth and to help the other, you know, others as well. Not just youth, but adults too.
And that's what we talk about too with parents, is like, you could be that parent who, when your, son or daughter brings their friends home and you start to notice the behaviors, you could be the one that, has the conversation with both of them going, hey, what do you guys know about online predators? Hey, what do you know about online recruitment and grooming, as a, group of 2 or 3 kids, knowing that they might see those signs in their child's friend.
Absolutely. And that's where the education piece is so very important, really helping people understand, what does it look like? Why the industry as a whole has started to train all kinds of individuals, flight attendants, speaking with ER physicians and medical professionals to say, what does it look like? What are the signs and symptoms? Education is such a huge issue in relationship to managing this problem in our country and around the world, to say that we can really fight trafficking if we recognize it and know what it is, and then the ability to
intervene. Absolutely. And it's so interesting to me, because more and more people, when I first started this quest, people thought I was nuts. They're like, prevention education, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, because I had had conversations with several of our friends that are survivors, and my heart was just breaking. And I'm like, you know what? The average age is 12 to 14. We got to go talk to those kids. We've got to have conversations with our youth so they know what it is, because parents sometimes are like, I don't want to, it's too uncomfortable, which I get it. This is a weird conversation to have.
And one of the myths is, if they don't know, it won't happen.
Exactly.
That's a mistake that we make as adults. If they don't know, it just won't happen. If they don't have to hear about it, then they won't. Well, what will happen is they won't recognize it, and then they'll be in the midst of it. So We've got to empower our children with the information that they have, and I can get on my soapbox and get passionate about this, but when we think in terms of a person who we do not get out of the life of trafficking, average life expectancy is 7 years. When you get into the life and you don't get out, the average life expectancy is 7 years. These individuals are dying in the midst of trafficking, by suicide, by drug overdose, by being killed by their traffickers and others. So we've got to save their lives, physically, emotionally, spiritually, intervene, and that's what we have to do.
Absolutely, and that's where education really does make the difference. It impacts our kids. We did a survey, a follow-up survey after we went and educated a bunch of youth at Rock Lake Middle, and 65% of our kids shared what they learned with either their parents or a friend. And to have a middle schooler have any kind of conversation is a miracle. But to have them talk about that, it's huge. We know education makes a difference, and it opens up the opportunity for the parents to have a very frank conversation about online safety, about safe adults, about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So education is really a key piece in thwarting and disrupting this cycle.
Absolutely.
Yeah, really great. So we're at 8:28. Sorry, water went down the wrong way. I'm going to give people online here a little, if they've got a question they can ask. But before we got on live, you were talking about some of the videos that you've put on Aspire Health. So why don't you share about a couple of the videos you guys are creating to help people deal with the current crisis?
Well, Aspire put together a number of videos around a number of different topics. The areas that I focused on were addressing the increasing anxiety and stress as it related specifically to COVID-19, taking a look at how to speak to your children about COVID-19, addressing the issues of substance abuse related to how to manage substance abuse during this period of time. From that perspective is, you may be using, you can't get in touch with your dealer, you're going to go into withdrawal, and you may end up seeking treatment and needing treatment. And then people turning to substances as a means of coping. We know that's not an effective strategy, but many people do that. Managing the depression related to COVID-19. Also included, one of the vignettes is on how to maintain a healthy relationship, an intimate relationship during this period of time where we're quarantined together. So if you go to our website, aspirehealthpartners.org, you can take a look at the top piece will be Aspire's response to COVID-19. Click on that, and it'll take you to the pages where there's a number of the different videos that you can pick and choose which ones you want to take a look at that can be helpful to you.
I accidentally put .com, so I will change that to .org.
It could be either one, .com or .org, actually.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, great. So aspirehealthpartners.com, some really great vignettes about how to manage the current crisis with your family and conversations to have. So Dr. Toal, thank you so much for being on with me tonight and just making yourselves available. You gave us some great scientific understanding of what happens to our brains under that kind of personal trauma.
Thank you. I appreciate you asking me, Jan, as always.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. You be safe. Mwah.
You too.
Everybody on Facebook, thank you so much for being on with us tonight. I'll do a recap Saturday morning at 11 a.m. And between now and then, y'all stay safe and pray for our survivors. All right. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.